Good afternoon, everyone. This is Tony Whitbeck. I am the CEO of Advisor Legacy. And with me today is Todd Dory. He's our Vice President of M&A. And Todd's going to take us through the majority of today's content. As you can see, the title is M&A Essentials for Advisors. So we do have a very large group today. And so all of the telephone lines have been muted. And there's the best way to ask a question is to go to your GoToWebinar control panel, and you can type in a question, and then at the end of today's presentation, we'll read through those questions and do our best to answer those questions. Also, in the GoToWebinar control panel, you're going to find that there are 10 handouts. One is a valuation brochure on our business valuations. We have a sample valuation. We have a case study on what's called the Max Val Predictor that shows when practices start to decline in value. We have a white paper on the 10 steps to sell a practice and another one on the 10 steps to buy a practice. So there's a lot of resources in the GoToWebinar control panel that you can download onto your computer and read them at your leisure. So before I turn it over to Todd, I want to do a couple of things. Number one, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Advisor Legacy and the services that we offer. So Advisor Legacy is a full service M&A firm that specializes in the financial services industry. So 99% of who we work with are financial advisors or banking institutions that do lend to the space. And then we work with law firms as well. But whether you're building your practice or living what you've built or you're leaving a legacy, we offer different services, and it doesn't really matter where you are in that advisor career path, if you will. So if you're building, we offer acquisition consulting. We have buying opportunities through our Advisor Legacy sales platform. We provide legal and lending support through partnerships that we have with banks and law firms. We offer continuity planning to help protect the value of your practice in the event of death and disability. We can do buy-side deal support. If you're a buyer and you found a seller but need some help, we can do that. And then if you're building, you may need some additional staff. And so we also offer a recruiting program to help identify potential candidates for your practice. If you're at the living stage of your career, one of the things that we offer is a business valuation to help chart the progress of the value of your practice. Now, really, valuations can be used across any stage of your career. We do entity planning. So many advisors decide to put together an entity to run their business. The entity is typically used to receive the compensation once the advisor receives the compensation personally. And then the entity will pay out the owner's wages, staff wages, expenses, and then make distributions to the owners. There's succession planning, and different than continuity planning, which is planning for death and disability. Succession planning can be either internal or external, where you find someone who's going to eventually take over your practice, and we typically recommend 3 to 5 years before the actual event. So you build that succession plan in advance. And then finally, if you're at the stage of your career where you're leaving a legacy or leaving the business, if you don't have a buyer, we can certainly help you find one through our Advisor Legacy sales process. We offer the sell side deal support. We have something called Next Gen Transitions. So if you're looking to sell internally to your G2 or Generation 2 advisor, we have a program for that. Again, we offer legal support, and we also have escrow services. Most deals have a portion of the money held back in escrow until the attrition clause has been met. And so in partnership with our law firm, we offer those services. Now, what I'd like to do next before I turn it over to Todd is just ask our audience 3 very simple questions, and it will help us understand our audience and perhaps have us tailor some of our comments. So this is the audience participation part. So I would ask, if you're multitasking, please just take a minute to answer these 3 questions. So here's the first question on your screen. Oops. Not sure how we got to there. 1 second. Okay. Todd, are you able to see that? It looks like it's taking my presentation off the screen when I open the polls.
I can see it, yes.
You can see the poll itself?
Yes, I can.
All right, so if those that are participating, if you could please click on the answer that best suits you. And we have 44% of you have voted, so we'd like to get as many as we can. We're at 68%. And I'm going to close the poll. And here's the results. So 83% are buyers and 17% are neither a buyer or a seller. So we have predominantly buyers on the platform. Since the technology isn't working too well here, well, I will ask the last two questions here, but I apologize for flipping back and forth. And so the next question is, when is the last time you've had a professional valuation performed on your practice? Yeah, 56% of you have voted. 67. All right, I'm going to close it out, and here's the results. We have 33% never, 3% less than 3 years ago, and 17% more than 3 years ago. So it looks like a third of you are due for a valuation. And then here's the last question. When's the last time, or do you have a written continuity plan in place to protect your practice in the event of death and disability? Okay, we're at about 2/3. I'm just going to read the results. So 67% of you do, and 33% of you don't. So again, a third needs to get a continuity plan in place. Maybe it's the same third that doesn't have a valuation. All right, well, sorry for having to click back and forth there. At this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Todd, and he's going to take us through the rest of the content. Again, if you would like to ask some questions, please use the GoToWebinar control panel to type in your questions, and at the end, we'll answer them, and you can download our documents from there as well. So Todd?
Thank you, Tony. Got a lot to cover today, so I'm going to jump right into it. As Tony mentioned, the objective of our services is to help financial advisors build, live, and leave a legacy. And today's subject matter really falls into two of those buckets, building a legacy through acquisitions, and then arguably one of our most important services is helping you leave a legacy through succession and the sale and transition of your practice. So the agenda for today is to go through most of the important considerations of deal making when buying or selling a practice, starting with business valuations. That's normally the starting place for either consideration. Then we're going to talk about the types of practice sales. There's quite a number of ways and you can position a sale or an acquisition. We'll touch on the process of selling for those different types of sales as well and get into a bit of the details and how those deals flow. And then get into the terms and structure of the deal, talking about legal, financial, tax consideration, some of the other deal terms that we typically see. And then most importantly, how we can help you. And certainly we have services for both buyers and sellers. For buyers, we can really act as your outsource M&A department and certainly increase the close ratio that you have when you get in front of prospects. And for sellers, and I know that we don't have a lot of sellers on this call, if any, the sale of a practice is probably the biggest milestone in your career, if not your personal life. Oftentimes, it's the most important asset that you have, and we understand how important that transaction is to you. So let's jump into it. The first item that we want to do an overview for is business valuations or practice valuations. And again, This is generally the starting point for most planning and executing of a practice sale and really getting to understand what the value of the business is. For sellers, that starting point should really ideally happen at least 5 years in advance when you start to manage the equity with an annual valuation and then look at other considerations that the valuation provides, like timing. So one of the things that's really important, or really two areas that it's important for the valuation to look at, is the quality of the practice and the efficiency of the practice and how that results in the profitability of the business. The way that we determine the quality of the practice in our own valuation process is through what's known as a market-based approach. And a market approach is similar to how a home is valued using comparables. So in this case, we're looking at the key performance metrics of your practice, things like quality of revenue, age of the clients, other demographics, asset velocity. There's quite a few key data points that go into that analysis, and we're going to compare those to our benchmarks for those key metrics and determine the overall quality of the practice. Having done so, then we can compare the practice to recent sales of a similar quality practice. And again, that's known as a market-based approach. We also use an income approach, or what's known as an earnings approach. And the purpose of that approach of value is to determine what's known as enterprise value, or that's the value of the operations of the business, and very specifically, the resulting profitability. So in that, we use discounted cash flow. We value the future revenue stream discounted for time, with the discount rate being built up of risk and opportunity costs. We take those two methods and the results of them and average them together equally weighted. That gives us the valuation result, and what that result is intended to illustrate is the average of actual price that we're seeing in the market today, and that's known as fair market value. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of perspective on how a valuation works. We certainly get a lot of questions about that. One of the specific questions, or a set of them, that we also get is, of all that information that goes into a valuation, what really impacts it? What are the key drivers or the most important factors that can give me, a better valuation result, or which can also detract from the result? So a number of years ago, we wanted to answer that question with data, and we did a regression study on our database to come up with, which of the many data points that we collect have the most impact on the valuation. So the top three that drive a positive result are the revenue ratio, that's recurring versus transactional revenue. That was the #1 impact. The operating profit of the practice and business was #2. And then #3 was the percentage of high net worth clients, which is another way to express what we refer to as client segmentation. The ratio of high value clients and high net worth clients to lower value clients has a significant impact on efficiency and profitability. The items that were the top detractors of value were sort of the other side of that coin, if you will. So the number of low value clients, just another way to look at client segmentation, was #1. The more lower value clients you have, generally speaking, the less efficient your practice is, the more staff you require, and the higher your expenses and lower your profit margin is. The number of older clients is #2. We have a very specific analysis, which I'll talk about in our valuation model, to determine the impact of that. And then #3 detractor is probably a little counterintuitive, and that is the number of professionals in the practice. The reason that we see that as a negative is because if people aren't managing segmentation of clients, then the alternative is to hire more and more staff, specifically associate advisors, which are the most expensive part of your expense budget, and that tends to detract from value. So hopefully that's helpful in giving you just a high level view of how you can improve valuation, or the things that can also take away from it. One of the things that we see in our own deal making, which we find to be fairly unfortunate, is a lot of use of rule of thumb valuation. In other words, advisors have an understanding that, typically you'll pay a multiple of 3 times recurring revenue, 1 times transactional, whatever that understanding is. And they're literally using those simple rules of thumb to determine the value of a sale or the value of an acquisition. And I want to point out why that's not a good approach, and certainly not worth saving the cost of evaluation. So what you can see on the slide here is an average valuation result. And I think this is a little dated because it's closer to 3 million now, but it's for the sake of this illustration, let's assume that the average today is 2.6 million in fair market value. And what that results in is a multiple of gross revenue of 2.35. And that average size practice is 151 million under management and just north of $1 million in GDC or revenue. What's important about this illustration, though, is if we factor in the actual analysis of evaluation that, again, looks at quality and profitability, you can see that the bottom 20% of results is 2.1 million, and the top 20% of results is 2.8 million, or multiples of 1.9 and 2.5 respectively. And what that means is that for an average valuation, the range of value is over $600,000 based on the 2.6 average number. Certainly, if you're using multiples, it would be very easy to be off by $100,000, but you could be off by quite a bit more than that. And if you look at that versus the cost of evaluation, it's certainly not worth taking the risk and using those simple multiples or calculations of value. When we talk about, thinking of multiples, again, it's a very common question that we get. It's really important that you understand when you hear, those reference to that the reason for people expressing multiples is another way to express the actual result of evaluation. It's not a methodology of value, and I think that's where people oftentimes get confused and tend to think of it as a methodology of value. And we use multiples in our own valuation deliverable, again, to compare results, or another way to express the result, but the result is in a dollar amount. So what we know about that, of course, is that recurring revenue is going to be more valuable. As I pointed out earlier, it's going to have an average multiple of the gross revenue or gross GDC of 2.5 to 3. Depending on how you monetize value, we see that go out all the way up to about a multiple of 4. Transactional revenue, more difficult to value. It depends on the nature of where those assets are held. But typically, you could say that, the multiple of transactional revenue is going to be generally in the range of 0.8 up to 1.2. In some cases, it has very little value if it's held in annuities, et cetera. In some cases, the value can be higher if there are things that can be transitioned in the future to recurring revenue. And then lastly, about the valuation, one of the things that's unique about our own process is we've developed a proprietary method of determining the future value or the peak of value in a practice by looking at the existing client group, the age of those clients, and their assets and revenue. And the reason that we were able to do that is we have a very significant database of client household data that allowed us to go into that database and assign specific average growth rates for each age of client. And then knowing the age of your clients and the assets and revenue that they have and produce, we can estimate, the tipping point of growth based on their age, asset accumulation, and then distribution. And what we learned from that is that the tipping point of client growth is the average age of 70. And so clients will continue to accumulate on average until they reach 70 with variable positive growth rates for each age. And then after the age of 70, There's variable negative growth rates, and of course they would become more negative the further away you get from 70. So this can be a really excellent way to determine when to sell, or if you're buying a practice, determine how long the existing group is going to grow, or if you're going to really need to focus on new client acquisition and generational planning. So now let's jump into types of practice sales. And I think this is something that a lot of people don't give a lot of thought to. I think most imagine that, as a seller, when I'm ready, I'm going to find someone to sell to and sell the whole practice to them. And if for a buyer, I need to find someone who's ready to do that. For buyers, understanding the options, I think, really puts a lot of extra tools in your acquisition toolbox and helps you overcome objections. For example, if you had a seller whose objection was, I'm not quite ready to exit, then you could propose a sell and stay strategy where you buy the equity and they stay on until they're ready to exit. So understanding these options, I think, can be really helpful for both sides of the sale. The first thing that we're going to look at is what we refer to as open market sales. And I want to qualify this a little because in our own open market sales, most of them are inter BD. And what that means is that when we have the practice listed, only buyers within that broker-dealer platform get to see that sale listed. That's not the case for all of our sales, and probably not the case for a lot of other open market platforms, but for our own, we tend to use that approach, so we're not repapering sales in most cases. So open market sales are really distinguished by the practice being listed and entertaining multiple buyer candidates. And there's definitely some advantages to both parties in open market sales. I think the advantage to the seller is this is generally where we see premiums of monetization of equity accomplished. The reason for that is pretty straightforward. It's competitive in an open market sale. You have more options to get a higher price. You have more candidates, more offers, more options. And so that tends to bring in a higher price. I would also argue from the seller side, advantages of fit can certainly be there when you're vetting multiple candidates versus just choosing one party that you happen to know. Then you have the option of choosing the best of a qualified group. And also the terms tend to be defined more precisely because most open market sales are managed professionally. There's also advantages to the buyer in this respect. One of the things that I don't think people really give a lot of thought to is that there's a significant time savings on the buyer side. When we bring a practice to sale, what you don't see is that oftentimes we have spent years helping that person get to the point where they're ready to transition their business. And from the buyer side, if they're out there prospecting for sales, they might develop that relationship over years as well. And the open market sale brings that sale to you as opposed to you having to make that effort. So certainly a lot of buyer candidates have recognized the savings of time and resources. The other advantage to the buyer that I would argue is that, again, open market sales are professionally managed. And the flip side of that coin, if you're working directly with a seller, the seller's state of mind is generally relatively emotional, and it's hard for them to make good business decisions when they're experiencing those emotions. And so having a professionally managed process can be quite helpful. The other type, I should say another type of sale, and this is the most common way that practices are transitioned. I believe it always will be. And the reason for that is that closed deals, as we refer to them, which is when the buyer and the seller have found each other and agreed to sell and buy between each other, those deals are really based on an existing and often a long-term relationship. And so I think as a result of that, that's why they're the most common way that practices are transitioned and probably will continue to be the most common way. The advantages to the seller in this case is really that they do have a relationship with the buyer. It's not always the case, but I would say more often than not, it is the case that they've known each other for years. There's been an understanding in place that when you're ready to sell, I'm ready to buy, that sort of thing. And so the seller really doesn't have to concern themselves with getting into a relationship with someone that they don't know that much about. So that tends to be the main advantage to the seller. Generally, their sale price and monetization of equity is going to be less, and the buyers will tend to really facilitate the terms and structure of the deal as well. Advantages to the buyer. I would say a lower price is certainly one of the advantages versus an open market sale, but maybe a higher investment in time on the front end, again, as I mentioned, in developing relationships with prospects to sell and the time and effort that you might put into that. Other advantages to the buyers, they often have a lot more experience. Most sellers would only sell one business in their lifetime, whereas many buyers that we work with have had several acquisitions, if not more than that. And so they tend to have a little bit higher level of experience. They have, in some cases, they even have team members who specialize in their acquisition activity. The one type of closed deal, which I'm going to expand on a little bit more, is an internal sale, or what we call a next-gen sale, which has its own unique value proposition. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. So now let's look at the process of selling. There's a bit of a different process for each of those options: closed market deals, open market deals, and internal transitions or next-gen sales. So here we're going to start out with closed sales. And again, we qualify closed sales as between a buyer and a seller who have found each other and largely have determined the fit through a longer term relationship. Oftentimes they will start with evaluation, but one of the downfalls to closed market deals that we've seen quite often is a lot of DIY going on. So sometimes, unfortunately, they're using simple multiples of revenue to determine the value, but ideally, we're starting out with evaluation, which is generally the starting point. There's a bit of negotiating that goes on in closed deals. I would say probably not that significant in a lot of cases because, again, the sellers don't have a lot of experience and certainly readiness and comfort level to actually negotiate, I would say, is relatively low, but there will be some agreeing to price and terms in that case. What we recommend from there is having either a term sheet or a letter of intent that outlines the terms and structure of the deal in a very simple to understand fashion, so both parties can understand and agree to those terms and structure prior to engaging an attorney to complete the legal agreements. So the use of a term sheet can be very helpful in your success of putting deals together. Then you get an attorney. Please do not use templates and complete your own agreements. That's been a big pitfall. We've seen some pretty serious repercussions of that. You certainly want to use an attorney, and better off one that has a lot of experience in our industry to complete the legal agreements. And then you have considerations of financing that can sometimes be the longest part of the process. If you're going through underwriting with a bank, we're seeing a lot of broker-dealer financing now, which is a little bit more streamlined, but typically you're going to have 40 to 60 days for underwriting before the deal can be funded. And typically both parties have to supply information, tax returns, and so forth for that underwriting process. Then the last step is transition planning. Probably one of the most important steps is how are you going to hand off those client relationships? What is your communication strategy with the clients? How long is the seller going to support the process of transition, et cetera? And also making sure that the boxes of the broker dealer are all checked, or whatever platform you might happen to be on. Lastly, you'll have a closing date, and normally that is the day after the seller's compensation cutoff. And then typically the seller would support the transition of the relationships if they're exiting the business for a period of 6 to 12 months. Now, if we look at open market sales process, there's a little bit more involved here because there's several steps of vetting candidates and also preparing the listing of the practice for sale. So generally, the first step in the process, you might have had evaluation as ahead of it. That's normally the case. Again, these types of sales are almost exclusively professionally managed. You don't see an individual creating an open market sale process and having the ability to list their practice, as you can imagine. So we're going to build a listing profile for the seller, try to touch on the important parts of the practice that a buyer would be interested in, make sure they understand what the goals and objectives of the seller are and what are some of the key metrics of the practice. Then you're going to have a period where we're soliciting buyer candidates, if you will, or allowing people to express interest in the sale. Generally in our own open market process, just as an example, we'll get somewhere in the range of 20 candidates to as many as 50. So it's a pretty aggressive marketplace currently, and there's usually a lot of interest in anything that comes up as an acquisition. Generally in that time frame of soliciting buyers, the next step would be allowing a select group of those candidates to make offers. And those offers are really just a good indication of their intentions if they are selected as the final candidate. Once those offers are determined, and the offers allow the process to vet and narrow down that group another time, then you're going to interview the best candidates in the group. And the interview, I would say, probably equally important to the offers, and that's where the fit is determined between the buyer and the seller. And it gives them an opportunity, if they don't know each other, to certainly get a feel for, do they like each other? Could they work together? Do they trust each other, and do they feel they'll take care of the seller's clients? Then we would generally work on a term sheet when the final candidate is determined, make sure that they're standing behind the offer that they put into the system. Once the term sheet is signed, we'll engage the attorney to complete the formal legal agreements. And usually the buyer will have their own attorney who would also want to review those agreements and provide feedback. Then going through the financing stage again, pretty much the same as the closed market deals. And then the transition planning in this step tends to be a bit different, again, because you have someone who's professionally managing it and certainly would have a lot of good best practices regarding the transition and a lot of experience as to what works and doesn't work. Generally, the closing completes the process on behalf of it being professionally managed, and then the two parties are really diligently working together to make sure that there's a great handoff of the client relationships. And one of the things that we recommend in that respect, and this applies to both open and closed deals, is communication between the buyer and the seller is very, very important. And we really recommend that once you get into the closing process, that you're discussing, things that are coming up, the operational details on a weekly basis, so you make sure that there's no misunderstanding or miscommunications and not allowing things to, become negative through the lack of information. Now I want to talk just briefly about internal or what we call next generation sales, and this is probably the fastest growing area of transitions that we're seeing in our industry today. And I think it will continue to be largely because practices are getting larger. They generally represent a significant enterprise with multiple associate advisors in most cases. And those practices, with all their complexity, are generally favored to transition internally. And there's quite a value proposition that goes along with that. One of them being the growth of the business. When you're selling the equity to the associates over a long period of time, making them into equity owners and rainmakers tends to enhance the growth versus that of the advisor being on their own. The transition of the practice is also probably the least eventful and the most smooth for the clients, because again, it happens over many years with very little change once the selling advisor exits the business. And the thing I like about next gen sales as well is you're actually creating a legacy. It's a little different when you sell your practice to an advisor down the street and it becomes their brand and their operations and so forth. But when your business continues to operate for years and servicing generations of clients, then it is the same practice that you built, which will continue many years after you exit it. So what you see on the screen here is an illustration of the growth value proposition of a next gen sale. And so you can see, the top illustration there is an advisor who's, generally speaking, what we see in our valuations, advisors who are within 5 years of retirement, actually sometimes more, tend to be in what we would refer to as the coasting stage. They're not pushing the pedal too hard to grow and market their business. They're satisfied with their income and so forth. So oftentimes the growth rates of those business is very low to negative. It doesn't mean they don't have the potential to grow. It simply means the advisor, is not making the effort at that point in their career. Perfectly understandable. The other scenario is when you start to transition equity over a long period of time. And for those internal transitions, we usually recommend a minimum of 5 years and ideally a 10-year time frame to transition that equity. Then you enhance the growth of the practice. Those younger associates in the practice are going to be a lot more motivated. They're in a very different place in their career. They're going to bring in younger clients, which is also going to help the value of the business and the long-term growth of the business. And so using a simple illustration here, where we have a 10% growth rate for 6 years versus a 3%, and that's probably generous, the 3%, you can see that the overall monetization of equity for the next gen sale is 1.8 million versus 1.2. So that gives you a little bit of feel for part of the proposition of internal or next gen sales. The other thing it tends to create is a next level of business management. And when you think about selling equity in a practice, you're really creating a partnership, oftentimes that incorporates the use of entities. Tony mentioned that we have an entity formation service that creates the formal legal entity for you, and also the partnership operating agreements along with that. So it really creates a higher level of business management. It tends to get people thinking of it more as a business and acting as, CEO, COO, and really, I think, enhances the overall professional aspect of the practice being run as a business and not more of a mom and pop type of operation. So let's jump into now, some of the considerations around terms and structure of a deal. And we always talk about, there's 3 elements of a deal: price, term, and fit. And yes, price, terms, and fit. And terms, I think, are often overlooked as being important, and I would say they're equally important as price. Maybe not quite as fit, but price certainly is supported by the terms of the deal. So first, we look at financing structures. For the buyer's side, understanding financing, and I would say most buyers do now, either creates an advantage for you or a disadvantage for you. And most deals today are lender financed. And what that means is that the lender financing is going to pay the seller a lump sum. So the days of, seller financing probably ended close to 10 years ago, where, the seller would largely hold the note. Now they're receiving, the majority of the financing and the majority of the sale price paid to them at closing. And then there's a balance due, typically 15 to 20%, that's either paid in cash, bank financed, or seller financed. And that balance due is really intended to facilitate a potential adjustment based on the attrition or look back in the agreement. So we look at a few different options here. You can get In some cases, banks will finance 100% of the sale price. In that case, you potentially would give them an 80% down payment, hold 20% in escrow pending the attrition measurement, and then that would be paid out adjusted as per that language in the agreement. Another typical, maybe the most typical structure is 80% lender financed, and then the balance, a 20% seller note, oftentimes a 5-year note, maybe 5% interest on that, or sometimes buyers are injecting their own cash into the balance due. Less common structures would be partial equity in the buyer's practice. We see this more in the RIA space, where you might be selling to a consolidator and so forth, and part of their value proposition for their end of things, I would argue, is exchanging partial equity for equity in their own practice, so they're not putting as much into it on the front end. Largely, those are contingent on the value based on the growth of the buyer's practice. And then very uncommon these days is where sellers are holding the majority of the note and not involving bank financing. And this is one of the areas, where we see if a buyer doesn't understand how to leverage financing, they come to the table and say, well, we want you to hold the note or most of the note, then that puts the buyer at a disadvantage competitively with other buyers who are really knowing how to leverage appropriately financing. And I would argue that financing is better for both parties, because for the buyers, they get 10-year amortization typically and a greatly improved cash flow of the sale. Another common area of consideration is the allocation of the sale price to taxes. We always recommend that you consult your tax professional in this respect, but we do have some standards, if you will, and those standards are based on the fact that most people's tax professionals agree with approximately the structure that you see on the screen. So what's being sold here is goodwill for an asset purchase agreement. And that goodwill is taxed as capital gains to the seller, and the buyer gets to write that off over a 15-year time frame. What the IRS or Treasury Department also expects is that if you're selling a business, you're providing consulting for the transition, and that consulting is in consideration of the sale price. So you need to have a bit of the sale price allocated to consulting. And that's ordinary income, 1099 to the seller. The buyer gets to write that off in the year that it's paid. And then lastly, we'll generally have a bit of an allocation to the non-compete language, non-solicitation language in the agreement. And the purpose of that is to simply make it more enforceable. Non-competes are difficult to enforce, and certainly in specific states like California, very difficult. So assigning value is one way to make sure that that language can be adhered to. Again, consult your tax professional on the allocation prior to going into the deal. Then if we look at some of the key terms of the deals, I'd say, some of the more important ones are the attrition language in the agreement. There's a lot of variation of that in the industry, certainly, with the time of the measurement, allowances of attrition, the specific language of how it's completed. We tend to focus on client attrition and not net assets. And we feel that client attrition is appropriate because really what we want to measure is, did the seller deliver what they sold within a reasonable time frame? Generally, that time frame is 6 to 12 months. You'll have other non-compete and non-solicitation language in the agreement that basically ensures that, if you're selling a client group and operating in a specific market, that you're not going to solicit those clients or, hang your shingle up again and start doing business as a financial advisor in that same market. It's generally dictated by the state law and pretty straightforward, I think, not something that people have to worry too much about, but certainly if you don't plan to not compete, don't sell your practice. And then lastly, there's a consulting period, how the seller stays on after the close. Usually 6 months is sufficient. There's certain, situations where larger practice might need more consulting after the fact, or in some cases, there's a buy and stay strategy, or excuse me, sell and stay strategy where the seller staying, but they're going to continue to work in the business after the close on behalf of the buyer. So that's an overview of, you know, different types of sales, the considerations of the process of selling, valuation, and so forth. And now I just want to touch briefly on how we can help in both of those situations. So we have a set of services for both open market and closed market deals. Our open market sales are what we call our Advisor Legacy Sales platform, where we represent the seller, and we have a whole team on our side that support the seller through every single step of the process. So it's quite involved. It takes about 4 months, and it really is, you know, a very precise, professionally managed process to make sure that the seller, you know, having only one sale in their lifetime and it being probably their most important asset, and certainly important in respect to the transition of those client relationships, which are very meaningful, making sure every step of that is completed appropriately. For closed market deals, we have a number of turnkey deal support services. We have one that's specific to next gen or internal sales. We have one for people who really just need to have the deal papered, where they have largely come to an agreement with the buyer or seller, and they just need a bit of consulting on the front end, and the legal agreement's completed. That's turnkey deal support standard, which is a flat fee of $59.95. We have our deal support plus, which is a fully inclusive process of valuation, M&A consulting, negotiating on the client's behalf, completing the formal legal agreements, and planning the transition. That is the $59.95 flat fee plus 1% of the sale price. And then here you can see that the next gen or internal sale deal support is a flat fee of $12,995. And that's a fairly inclusive process as well, where we provide the practice valuation and earnings model for the buyer, up to 4 meetings with an M&A coach, the formal legal agreements. And then we spend a fair amount of time coaching for 2 things. One, the transition of the practice, and that's again over a longer period of time, and also the transition of ownership, transition to ownership, I should say, of the associate advisor, which tends to be a really important part of that consideration. So as you can see, there's many ways that we can help you in both open and closed sales. I think I'm going to turn it back over to Tony, and we'll open it up to any questions that you have. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Todd. Before we take some questions, and I can see that we have at least one in our queue, I wanted to just talk a minute about our valuation. So the valuation, the third of you haven't had one done ever. We have a fantastic valuation that's won some recent awards from wealthmanagement.com and Think Advisors, the Luminary Awards. And you'll see here that when you purchase a valuation, you get the report, but you also get a 45-minute consultation to go through the report with you and to share with you ways that you can increase the value of your business. Now, purchasing the valuation is quite simple. You can go to our website and you can buy it online with a credit card. Once you make the payment, you'll be emailed instructions. Then you'll do a data gathering for us. It's quite straightforward. Once we receive all the data, we'll produce the deliverable in 10 to 15 business days. We'll send it to you, and then we'll schedule the one-on-one consultation. Our retail price for valuations is $12.95, and we do have some discounts that are available for partner firms. When you go to our website, it's advisorlegacy.com, and then under Take Actions, the very top offering is Purchase an Advisor Business Valuation. All right, so let's get on to some questions. And the first question is from Joe. And so is the slide deck going to be shared after the webinar? A recording will be shared, Joe, and so you'll be able to listen to the broadcast again. It looks like that's the only question, Todd. So again, I want to remind our viewers that they can download some handouts right from the GoToWebinar control panel. And each of you will receive a follow-up email along with a link to the replay.
I see a hand up, Tony.
What's that?
I see a hand raised.
Hand raised. Okay. So Nicole, I am going to unmute your microphone. All right, Nicole, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just curious if you have any thoughts on the trends for M&A for 2024. Obviously, 2023 was kind of a slow year with this, a lot of these acquisitions. Just wondered what your thoughts are.
I'd be happy to answer that one.
Thank you.
Since we live in that space, we're always thinking about that. Certainly, great question. I think this year is going to be good. I think unfortunately, what happened is we saw a bit of a triggering event, for the baby boomer generation of, sellers that we've been anticipating for the last 7 years or more. When COVID happened, I think that created a bit of a triggering event, but unfortunately, shortly thereafter, we entered into this time frame of a lot of volatility in the stock market, and last year was a good example of that. And when that happens, when that type of distraction happens, sellers tend to hunker down. They don't have the capacity to make the emotional decision to sell because their primary concern becomes, I need to take care of my clients first, and when things get better, then I'll visit the idea of transitioning. Now that that's, arguably starting to improve, I think, we're seeing a lot of activity starting at the end of last year and then moving into this year. So I anticipate, knock on wood, we don't get back into a period of high volatility in the market, that we're going to see a lot of transition activity. By our estimates, that should continue to grow and likely peak in about 2029. But the next, between now and then should represent probably the greatest opportunity of acquisition activity that we've seen in the industry.
Nicole, any other questions?
That was great. Thank you.
You are welcome. I'm going to remute your microphone. And I don't see any other hands raised, Todd, and I don't see any other questions listed in our control panel. So I want to thank everyone for taking the time out of your day today to listen to our M&A Essentials. Hopefully you found that helpful. Please visit our website at advisorlegacy.com to learn more about the services that we offer, and have a great day.